Mark is the earliest narrative gospel. The other two synoptic gospel authors, Matthew and Luke, depended on Mark. Without Mark, their own narratives about Jesus would be unrecognizable, and probably just not be. Scholars can be sure of this Markan priority due to patterns of agreements in the synoptic gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, their shared basic sequence of stories, and the particular ways both Matthew and Luke changed the stuff they got from Mark to write their stories. By this and other scholarly arguments, we can be sure that Mark came first and that Matthew and Luke used Mark as their source. Hence, the Passion story in Mark is the earliest gospel form of it we know. As we've explored elsewhere, the Gospels demonstrate third-generational interest. In other words, the Gospels were written by third-generational people living after the time of Jesus. Consequently, their authors were probably not alive at the time of Jesus' death or when he was first proclaimed risen. They never met the pre-Paschal Jesus. This raises important questions. According to the Passion story in Mark, every follower Jesus handpicked abandoned him. One follower betrayed him. Another follower denied him. So, no intimate follower of Jesus was present for Jesus' tortures and crucifixion. Decades later, Mark wrote down his Passion report. Ultimately, we must ask, from where did Mark get all this information? Could there have been a pre-Markan Passion story that existed before the anonymous author called Mark wrote down his story? Surely. Some biblical scholars believe it did and that Mark borrowed from that story. Do we see such an earlier account? Indeed we do, inside our New Testament. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 to 8. On your screen, I'd like you to look at that text in red. That's it, folks. That's the earlier Passion story. Those red words, together with the blue, present us with the most ancient traditional element we have as Christians. The Passion story. That's the red. Yes, the resurrection account is also just as old, right there with it. But for the moment, I want you to put that blue line aside. I just want you to focus on the red. Read this earlier Passion story over again very carefully. It's pretty pithy, isn't it? Tell me, do those red lines say anything about Jesus being arrested in a garden? Jesus forced to endure an initial status degradation ritual meant to publicly destroy him? Peter's disloyalty? Jesus forced to endure another status degradation ritual before Pontius Pilate and Roman soldiers? Jesus' final degradation being crucified? Jesus being buried with Israelite elites? The historical Paul wrote the document we call 1 Corinthians. He probably composed this letter in Ephesus sometime between August 52 and October 54 in the 1st century Common Era. But those red and blue words on your screen come from even earlier times. Thus, the lines are pre-Pauline, earlier than Paul. Scholars call these lines a pre-Pauline charismatic formula. At Corinth, Paul and the Jesus group had memorized those lines first spoken within 20 years of Jesus' death and resurrection. By comparison, the Passion story found in Mark was composed around 70 Common Era. Get out your Bible and compare 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verse 3b through 5 with Mark chapter 14 verse 1 through chapter 15 verse 47. Look at that difference. It's colossal. Then consider the tremendous difference in disagreement between the Passion story according to Mark and the Passion story according to John. The agreement between the Markan Passion and the Johannine Passion is just a mere 15.5%. That's a whopping 84.5% disagreement. Clearly, folks, Mark didn't read John, and John did not read Mark. Unless you are a fundamentalist, you should be able to see that the story of Jesus' Passion grew more complex long before Mark wrote down his gospel. In fact, there were multiple versions of the evolving story floating around the Mediterranean world before Mark was composed. How else can we explain why Jesus says so much in the Passion accounts of Luke and John than he does in Mark? This is true of the Last Supper scenes also. Jesus barely says anything in Mark, or Matthew, who slavishly follows Mark, but Luke explodes with dialogue. His Jesus has so much more to say. And the Last Supper in John? Wow, it is so different. So unlike the Synoptics. For John, the Last Supper is a farewell dinner, but it's not a Passover meal. And John entirely omits the institution of the Eucharist. He instead writes about a foot washing that is found nowhere in Mark, Matthew, or Luke. Next come 4 chapters of dialogue. 4 chapters between the Johannine Jesus and his innermost circle. What gives? Why these tremendous differences? Folks, looking back at 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 3b through 5, it becomes evident that both John and Mark embellished and invented many details. From where does all this development come? All of it comes from pietism, says context scholar John Pilch. Yeah, some of it was the memory of actual events, many of which were not seen close up. None of the gospel accounts got recorded with video precision and factual exact accuracy. The evangelists were neither eyewitnesses nor 21st century journalists seeking just the facts. So some of the story is theological fiction meant to convey the more profound truths about Jesus. Invented scenes and details intended to bring out the meaning of Jesus. In any case, the engine that drove the evolution of the Passion narratives was pietism. Yes, Jesus existed historically. Yes, he really did die, and he really was crucified. No friend of Jesus had to be present at the cross to eyewitness what happened to Jesus in order to affirm that. And they would have been too embarrassed to invent such a shameful death for Jesus. But what about the details of what happens between his arrest and the disposal of his body? This uppity peasant nothing person from Nazareth was condemned by Pontius Pilate, sure, but did he really have a dialogue with the prefect? Or did Pontius Pilate merely sign an order and have Jesus dragged off? It's okay that things develop and that our Gospels are not 21st century fact-precise biographies. Not everything revolves around us and our Western obsessions, Americans. You know, Lent is a good time for metanoia. The world doesn't revolve around us. Despite Scott Hahn and his friends' best efforts, the Catholic Church in official documents acknowledges the evolution of New Testament writings and the Passion story. Everything for the story of Jesus begins with the resurrection. Easter is ground zero for everything else, not Good Friday. Without resurrection appearances, no one would have written anything down other than a footnote about Jesus or his shameful death. In those post-resurrection appearances, Israelites learned that Jesus was raised and exalted by the God of Israel. What else would be needed to empower first-century Mediterranean believers, anyway? As Pilch explains, only afterward did interest and concern grow for the events that led up to Jesus' death.
Now, when you know that ancient writers told stories as a means of getting across ideas, and they didn't tell stories to report to you the news of the day, again it raises the question, how do we know what is historical and what is not? Now, this list just absolutely blows my mind. This is, the Gospel of John does not have a single one of these things in it. Does not have the temptation, the wilderness, rejection, and death. Not a single parable. Virtually every New Testament scholar I know would say to you that if there is anything in the sayings of Jesus that's likely historical, it's the parables. There's not a single one in John. The Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes are not in John. The Lord's Prayer is not in John. All these stories, Peter's confession, the transfiguration. I mean, there's some really good stories there. Now, what does that mean? Does it mean John didn't know them, never heard them? Or does it mean he knew them and decided not to use them? John does tell us in his gospel, right at the end, he said, there are many other things Jesus said and did that are not written in this book. That suggests that he knew more than he wrote down. But come on, you don't put in the Lord's Prayer? This is even more amazing. These are in John and John alone. The prologue on "In the beginning was the Word," all of that. The wedding in Cana. Nicodemus' story. This guy coming to Jesus at night and asking all these... This dialogue goes on. The story of the woman at the well. Now, what's the matter? They didn't know that story? Or did they know it again and choose not to use it? All the I am sayings, I am the bread of life, I am the door, I am the resurrection and the life. All of those I am sayings that are in the Gospel of John, nowhere else in early Christian literature. Nowhere. So did Jesus say any of those, or are those the creation of early Christian preachers using Jesus' stories? Difficult to tell. It gets much more difficult. Remember the story of the woman caught in the act of adultery? That one is especially interesting. It's in the Gospel of John now. It almost certainly was not in the original Gospel of John. And it's in no other early Christian writing, and it's a great story. And when you look in the Gospel of John, it's very obvious that it's been inserted into the text because it breaks up the train of thought. So it's been rather clumsily inserted. And you can hypothesize that somebody read John and said, come on, bird brain, you can't leave that one out. It's too good a story. And stuck it in. Does that mean it's not from the historical Jesus? It may well be from the historical Jesus. And somebody thought it was too good a story to leave out and so inserted it awkwardly in the Gospel of John, but nowhere else in all of early Christian literature. I am the light of the world. They don't know that. I'm the good shepherd. None of this. This is the bombshell. No other early Christian writing tells the story of the raising of Lazarus. Now think about that, folks. If that actually occurred as a historical event, can you imagine that word wouldn't spread like wildfire? And so why is it not in any other gospel? Not only the 4 in the New Testament, it's nowhere else in early Christian writing. Maybe it's a theological creation, not a historical event. And again, we got to try to figure out how are we going to tell the difference. Foot washing at the Last Supper, that one's puzzling too. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's about the sharing of bread and wine, right? They don't do that in John. It's a foot washing. We've sort of dumped the John version and we follow the Matthew, Mark, and Luke versions. Does that mean John didn't know about the sharing of bread and wine? Does it mean that Matthew, Mark, and Luke never heard of the foot washing thing? The Pope, the new Pope, bless his heart. Did y'all see the news story about him washing the feet of a woman? And the Italian bishops were scandalized. Good for him. But that doesn't appear in any other gospel. This stuff, not a single one of those stories appears in any other Christian literature. Now, You can tell that in trying to sort our way through this, we have to develop some fairly careful criteria by which we will make judgments about what is historical and what is not. We also have to come to terms with the fact that some of the history doesn't matter. Whether Jesus was crucified on Thursday or Friday is not a great issue in my life. It might be a great issue whether or not he is the Lamb of God slain for the sins of the world. So theologically, that story might have great meaning to me. Historically, it has none whatsoever. So one of the things that we have to do is we have to try to sort out what's historical and what's not, but also what's important that it's historical and what's not. Would everybody agree here that the crucifixion, it's important that that's a historical event? Christianity would change fundamentally if that were not a historical event. But the day of the week doesn't matter much. So we got a big sort job, and we have to be very, very careful in working out criteria for how we'll make judgments among all these things.
Judas and Spy Wednesday mark some of the darkest traditions we have as church. Good stories need memorable villains. As the story of Jesus percolated throughout history of various cultures, the villain, Judas, got seasoned very well. Outrageously, Judas became a motivation for genocidal hatred against the Jews, something unintended by any New Testament author. But who was Judas? Why did he betray Jesus? Folks, the New Testament gives few and contradictory answers as to Judas's motives. Even the exact circumstances of his death are confused and messy. Despite this fact, gospel presentations of his demise colored the Christian ideas and imagery concerning hell. Since medieval times, Christians have imagined Judas to be the very personification of the Jewish people. For centuries, Judas has been depicted in a vile and vicious caricature of Jews that has enabled genocidal tendencies in imperial Christianity. Because of this, some scholars, like Chaim Maccabee and John Shelby Spong, have even doubted that Judas ever existed. Perhaps, scholars like these speculate, early Galilean Israelite Jesus groups invented Judas to symbolize the Judean elites who rejected Jesus and tried to destroy him. Centuries later, in the Middle Ages, this got co-opted by Christians to serve anti-Jewish hatred. But there are problems with this theory. Multiple New Testament sources attest to Judas betraying Jesus. And given the embarrassing nature of Jesus choosing poorly one of his own closest followers, which in 2020 hindsight he kinda did, it is doubtful that Judas was an invented literary device. Therefore, Judas probably existed and did something infamous to get remembered so negatively. At least 3 of the 12 bore the name Judas: Judas Iscariot, Judas Thaddeus, and Judas called Thomas Didymus for twin. Barbarian Israelites remembered with great pride the hero Judas Maccabeus, Judah the Maccabee. So the name Judas was very popular in Jesus' day. One of Jesus' own brothers was named Judas. As far as Iscariot goes, different proposals have been offered explaining it. Perhaps Iscariot simply derives from the Aramaic or Hebrew expression for a man from Kerioth. But some have suggested that the term Iscariot suggests Judas to have been a knife man, a dagger man. Maybe Judas, together with Simon Zelotes, were hillside daggermen bandits, formerly Galilean peasant farmers who had lost their ancestral lands to greedy elites in kangaroo courts. Who can say for sure? The earliest mention of Jesus being betrayed or handed over comes from Paul, specifically his Eucharistic institution narrative. But Paul is silent about Judas or anyone else doing the handing over of Jesus. Although the most ancient element in our tradition, the Passion story evolved greatly over time. The catalyst for Jesus being crucified, according to the later synoptic tradition, was revenge on the part of Judean elites having been humiliated by Jesus' prophetic sign action in the temple ruckus. The earliest written gospel, Mark, doesn't really provide exact motivation for why Judas betrayed Jesus himself. But Matthew augments and corrects the anonymous evangelist we call Mark. Matthew claims that Judas betrayed Jesus specifically for 30 pieces of silver. That was Judas's motivation according to Matthew. All Gospels agree that Judas was a core member of the Jesus faction. Therefore, Judas would have given Jesus his word of honor to be absolutely committed to his cause and person. For Judas to take a bribe assisting in revenge against Jesus would be extremely shameful. As context scholars Bruce Molina and Richard Warbaugh explain, in the honor-shame Mediterranean world of the Gospels, loyalty to your kin, in-group, or patron is supremely virtuous. Hence, betrayal is one of the most shameful biblical crimes. And this is how Matthew paints Judas. Even though Matthew depicts the death of Jesus as conforming to God's plan, keep in mind that all predestinarian language in the Bible is always after the fact predestination. That does not exonerate the Matthean Judas. Matthew still presents Judas committing a heinously shameful act, nevertheless. And yet, it is so important to point out that according to Matthew, Judas does repent. He changes behavior in metanoia. Before the vengeful chief priests, repentant Judas proclaims he betrayed innocent blood. Consequently, Judas publicly redresses his lost honor and signifies his repentance by hanging himself. It was out of repentance, not psychological guilt, that the Matthean Judas hung himself. Remember, Judas, Matthew, Jesus, and all other biblical characters and authors, Middle Eastern North African personalities, were quite anti-introspective, and as such, did not experience psychological guilt. The cultural world of the Bible is a shame culture, not a guilt culture. Fundamentalists, in service to mental idolatries, attempt impossible harmonizations of contradictory gospel verses and passages, trying to force-fit squares into circles. But despite their mental gymnastics, we simply cannot escape that the New Testament presents radical discrepancy in two different accounts of Judas's death. In the Matthean version, Judas repented and committed suicide. But according to the author of Luke Acts, Judas never repented. Nevertheless, God, presented very much as a Mediterranean godfather, got even with him, pitching him like a football and exploding him in gory shame, guts and all. But what really happened to the historical Judas? How did he really end up? We don't know. Again, New Testament documents are not transcripts of factual events, but present interpretations of events, ideas, and realities. The New Testament writings evolved. By the time we reach the fourth gospel called John, its final version coming around 100 Common Era, Judas had evolved into a greedy, thieving son of a bitch. By the way, a very convenient picture for centuries later anti-Jewish caricatures. Judas is depicted as a money man in John, the keeper of the common purse who, not unlike many corrupt United States clergy abusing their parishes, enjoys stealing from the common purse. Interestingly, though, the fourth gospel called John is completely silent about bribing Judas with silver pieces. How much can be said for certain about the historical Judas other than Jesus chose him to be a member of his innermost followers, and Judas was involved in handing Jesus over to Judean authorities? But perhaps some cultural insights can help us to see poor Judas and what caused his downfall in a clearer, culturally plausible way. Perhaps some helpful insight can be found in exploring Mediterranean cultural secrecy as employed by Jesus. Now that might sound odd to some readers of the Bible. Jesus was secretive? Hey man, Jesus is the light of the world. He doesn't hide anything. Well, fellow Christians, please be very careful, because reading the Gospels respectfully is quite sobering. Jesus was a secret keeper, folks. And I gotta tell you, there is no big theological messianic secret in Mark or any other gospel. As context scholar John Pilch rightly says, the so-called messianic secret of Mark has been overplayed by exegetes and theologians. There is no messianic secret in Mark, but there is plenty of culturally normal secrecy and deception, most common to the Mediterranean Middle Eastern worlds, to be found in Mark and the other Gospels? Sure. In the cultural world of the Bible, you don't owe strangers and outsiders the truth. Jesus lived by that understanding, folks. As context group scholar Jerome Nere explains, Middle Eastern North African personality Jesus himself mandated secrecy and deception. Look at how the Mediterranean Jesus commands about disguising or hiding fasting, or about giving alms. Whatever the act of piety be, Jesus says it has to be kept hidden, secret, and disguised from the outsiders to the Jesus group. Consequently, outsiders to the Jesus group are deceived into thinking that Jesus and his followers reject the Torah and its observances. Folks, there is no getting around the fact that Jesus, as presented by the Gospels, consciously and deliberately conceals information. Well, seeing Jesus in a culturally plausible way as secret keeper, we can now look at Judas as a secret leaker. By way of John Pilch, here may be a very interesting proposal. Maybe the historical Judas was a secret leaker. Imagine him as a teenage blabbermouth who boasted before the Sanhedrin about Jesus. The Judean authorities get him to leak in-group info that Jesus was Messiah and God's Holy One. Maybe Judas blabbed, broke under pressure after having been arrested himself. Speculative, I know, but not unwarranted. He may have done what he did out of coercion, or perhaps with good intentions, having zero clue it would lead to Jesus' death. Or maybe he did it as a desperate means of saving his fellow poor, starving Galileans, by way of necessitating Jesus' unveiling to Israel. We can't say for certain, folks. Just like we should not obnoxiously say Judas is in hell. In any case, we don't know. However, we also do not have a consistent picture of Judas in the Gospels, certainly not enough to feign certainty that he was a money-obsessed villain. On the contrary, we have good reason to believe the portrayals of him by the Gospels and Acts, none of which were 21st century historically biographically precise works, are exaggerated and slanted in an extremely negative way. After all, they had been seasoned by decades of bitterness, completely lacking any defense from Judas himself. It's like judging a matter based on one end of a telephone conversation. We don't get Judas's side. One-sided telephone conversation presentations of various early Jesus group figures happens quite often in the New Testament. Diotrephes and the Johannine successionists, Jezebel, the Nicolaitans, the so-called Synagogue of Satan, Ananias and Sapphira, and Simon Magus, all are very much presented like Judas's. We never get these characters' end of the telephone conversation, do we? Therefore, should we arrogantly hazard these folks are all damned to hell? The idea that inspired scripture tells me enough about these reprobates and that's all I need to know reflects a dangerously naive and theologically unhealthy attitude. As we have explored many times before, the Gospels evolved and therefore cannot be transcriptions of factual events or literary photographs of historical happenings. The teaching church recognizes that the evangelist, Gospel Development Stage 3, interprets events from Jesus' life, Stage 1. So also, as with the various Gospel Jesuses, yes, that's right, plural, plural Jesuses because there are several. The plural Judases we see in Matthew and Luke Acts are not photographs, but stage 3 interpretations. Okay, so what are the Spy Wednesday takeaways from all this? As we indicated earlier, since the Middle Ages, Judas has been misused as a symbol of hatred for all Jewish people. This horrific practice didn't end in post-World War II times. Vatican II did not effectively kill it, and neither did the half-assed apologies given by recent popes to the Jews. I have friends in Miami, South Florida, in the Archdiocese of Miami, who recall Lenten advice they were given by Irish priests back in the 70s and even 80s, telling them it was a virtuous thing to go sock a Jew in the jaw during Holy Week. Historically, Judas Iscariot, as the Jews personified, has been a terrible engine for this ongoing Christian evil. You know, religion can be great when accompanied by heightened awareness and sensitivity for the other, in a deepening and mature consciousness. But it can also be a nightmare, as when we scan our tradition for theological justifications to hate and oppress other groups. The terrible confusion of a badly misunderstood historical associate of Jesus, employed continually to villainize and murder the Jewish people, should give us Christians pause to reflect seriously before we triumphalistically adulate ourselves. There's more to the mystery of Judas than our prejudiced idea of Judas. And that's true with everything else. Sometimes terribly tragic things happen to familiar places, beloved places that we have taken for granted in our life or even in our faith walk, that enable us, or empower us rather, to not take them for granted, to look at old things new, to shake us up and see things with new eyes and better appreciate what we have. If ever there was a time in the church year that grants us opportunity for that, it's Holy Week. We must not just turn the Passion of our Lord into a theological boilerplate. Informed by John Pilch in the Context Group, we can see that the Markan report of the death of Jesus, that's the Passion according to Mark, foundational to the other two synoptic Passion stories, the one found in Matthew and the one found in Luke, presents Jesus as the perfect Mediterranean male, behaving the most honorable way as he faces death. Very early on in the gospel storyline of Mark, the Markan Jesus has made enemies of powerful people, Pharisees and Herodians. They resolve to kill him in Mark chapter 3, verse 6, way early on in the story. So Jesus' Nazareth family takes immediate action to save his life. They declare him crazy. He's out of his mind, Mark chapter 3, verse 21 reports. In the ancient Israelite world, if somebody shamed another person and did not make appropriate amends, that other person or his avenger was obliged to murder him. Well, Jesus has done that. He has shamed very powerful Herodians and Pharisees, and those men have avengers, and those avengers are going to take Jesus out. There is no escaping this fate, except if the offender's family declares that offending person crazy. But now, crazy family member cannot leave the family circle. He will never be let out of the house again. He cannot marry. He can't do his normal work. All normal life for this man has come to a halt. And so the offender might as well be dead. The Markan Jesus, my friends, is the offender. He never pulls back. He doesn't practice greater caution or prudence. He continues on, pissing people off throughout the storyline, until the chief priests and the scribes and the Jerusalem elites find a way to arrest him and have him put to death. Mark chapter 14, verses 1 to 2. When the Markan Jesus is put on trial, whether by the Sanhedrin in Mark chapter 14, verses 53 to 65, or under Pontius Pilate's authority, Mark chapter 15, verses 1 to 15, the game of challenge and repost, which Jesus, the Middle Eastern male, was a master of, the social game of competing for honor, is over. Going to court in the Middle East, the Mediterranean world, is shameful. A person who feels compelled to take another to court admits defeat by that course of action, even though that person may have bribed the judges to win the case. Look at Matthew chapter 5, verse 25 to 26. The only way out of jail in this world of the Bible is to bribe your way out. The community knows grievances should be worked out apart from the courts, since they were kangaroo courts, unreliable. Proverbs chapter 25, verses 8 to 10. Even Jesus affirmed that wisdom in Matthew chapter 5, verse 25. So now that the Markan Jesus has found himself in court, as it were, there is absolutely no way he can win. His fate is sealed. He did not have the wherewithal to head this off. He's a peasant folk healer, remember? In these final days, of the 12 that Jesus handpicked to be his innermost circle, one betrayed him, one denied him, and all abandoned him. This is not the gospel according to John, where the beloved one is with him till the end. No, nobody's with him to the end in Mark, the earliest gospel. So what is Jesus' best strategy? Well, suffer silently in truly Mediterranean manly fashion. If you have to respond, give pithy, cryptic responses. Otherwise, stay silent. Notice that the Markan Jesus gets crucified at 9 a.m. Passers-by revile him. The chief priests and scribes challenge him. Those crucified with him also abused him verbally. Again, note that this is not the Lucan version we just read Sunday, where there is a good thief and there is a bad thief. No, Luke adds all that. At noon, darkness comes over the land until 3 p.m. The Markan Jesus is hung on the cross for 6 hours, and in Mark's account, he hasn't spoken or cursed or cried or shouted. He hasn't boasted. At 3 p.m., Jesus cries something out in Aramaic. While our written text is quite clear to read, and Mark provides us a translation, the bystanders were obviously confused. They thought he was calling for Elijah. You know, we have a beautiful Tenebrae tradition in our church. We have a beautiful tradition about the 7 last words or the 7 last sayings of Jesus. But we have to ask, did the historical Jesus actually speak intelligibly from the cross? Research on crucifixion notes that the victims of crucifixion did not die from loss of blood, but rather from suffocation. The posture of the crucified person makes it impossible for the diaphragm to work properly. Lungs do not inflate sufficiently with oxygen, so one gradually suffocates. Suffocation is not a pleasant sight to witness. My own mother, God rest her soul, died a very slow and painful death with total lung failure. I watched that. It is not an easy death. Some cancers, in like fashion, destroy the lungs, making breathing difficult and eventually impossible. The crucified person's mouth is open in order to gasp and grasp at whatever little oxygen it can. It becomes dry. Speech becomes unintelligible, if not entirely impossible. What the Markan Jesus said after 6 hours on the cross was quite likely so garbled, it was misunderstood. Shortly after that, the Markan Jesus shrieked and died. The response of the centurion reported by Mark is very significant. Our English translation reads, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." Mark chapter 15, verse 39. The problem is the Greek text of Mark does not have a definite article before son. Hence, the proper translation of the centurion's remark is, "Truly, this man was a Son of God." I mean, the centurion was not a believer. He was a polytheist. So we must consider what Son of God would mean to a person like him. As a soldier in charge of 100 men, actually it was 80 men, not 100, men who were not always engaged in battle, this centurion was familiar with how stalwart soldiers amused themselves. Out in the barracks, they would fight each other, wrestle, they'd have contests of strength, and often one man in the barracks was stronger than all the rest. Such a soldier would be considered more than human, better than human, or a son of a god. That is, having godlike qualities. So the centurion's comment recognizes something about Jesus, who languishes in silence for 6 hours in perfectly Mediterranean manly fashion. What the soldier is saying, in effect, is, what a badass. He died like a Mediterranean hero, with honor. Specifically, what impressed the Mediterranean centurion is how he breathed his last. That is, the manner in which Jesus died. Perhaps this centurion had witnessed so many crucifixions that Jesus's surprised him. The victim was naked, not like our crucifixes that we see Jesus with the little white cloth underwear. There was none of that in an actual crucifixion. Naked. Stress caused the victim to defecate and urinate on himself. The experience made the victim almost crazy, agonizing pain. He would scream and curse and shriek and cry and befoul himself, not able to control his genitals. The body does weird things when it's crucified. The sphincter is out of control, as is the bladder. Few, if any, crucified people behaved like the legendary Eleazar or the 7 young men in 2 Maccabees, or like Jesus, the way all the Gospels report him dying. So in effect, this centurion is saying, I have seen many men crucified, but I have never seen anyone die like this, bearing his pain and suffering in silence and screaming only at the very end. Truly extraordinary. Truly godlike. This interpretation is a culturally plausible explanation of the event, as it may indeed have occurred at the actual crucifixion. Gospel formation stage 1. In the Gospel called Mark, written some 40 years later, the evangelist we name Mark has reinterpreted the event, which is why some translations report the centurion's words as, truly this man was the, should read a, Son of God. But what does it mean for Jesus to suffer on behalf of believers? Mourning and celebration are juxtaposed so closely in our tradition, even to the breadth of a Holy Saturday, between the devastating silence of Good Friday and the joyous Alleluias of Easter Sunday. Of course, everything in our New Testament and our existence as Christians proceeds from Easter. We are an Easter people, after all. But it's easy to skip over the burial of Jesus and the mourning that ordinarily would follow an Israelite burial, so as to miss out on just how significant resurrection was for our ancient ancestors in the faith. Over several videos, I want to explore with you the significance of Israelite burial and mourning custom. The purpose will be so as to better appreciate the heart of Easter. Today we'll be looking at the usual process of burial and mourning for first century Israelite elites. The Gospels hint at important ancient burial and mourning practices, quite remote for United States Christians. Consider, what is going on exactly in the various Gospel accounts about Jesus' burial and the women subsequently going to anoint him? Wasn't his corpse inaccessible to these women? It was being held in custody under Roman guard, right? Wasn't it sealed away, therefore? Locked behind a stone? Since the Gospels all attest to Jesus' body being treated thus, how could Mary Magdalene, whether alone, as the fourth Gospel reports, or in the company of other women, as the synoptics say, who disagree with John, ever hope to reach the body of Jesus, much less anoint it? Investigating these questions, diving deep into them, raises many fascinating issues. What about the story of the women going to anoint the dead Jesus is factual or historical? Stage 1 of Gospel development. And what about it was theologically invented, crafted later on, stage 2 and 3 of Gospel development? Also, some pretty heavy theological stuff is getting raised. By interrupting the mourning and burial process, what do the resurrection accounts say about the death of Jesus? Was it right and necessary, in accord with God's will? Or was it wrong, and thus overturned by God? It's going to take several video presentations to explore these questions. First, in order to get there, it is important to understand the meaning of Israelite burial customs and the mourning process of Jesus' day. This has been preserved for us in ample first-century archaeological evidence from Syro-Palestine and subsequent scribal Pharisaic documents. Cultural anthropology and the social sciences will help us sift through and rightly contextualize the data. I'm going to be drawing from the insights and guidance of context scholars Bruce Molina and Richard Rohrbaugh here. We should explain that life for ancient Israelites, all collectivistic, anti-introspective, dyadic personalities, was an existence where everybody lived together. They lived together as a group self, having one group conscience. All were embedded into the most significant family male or patriarch. Therefore, first-century Israelites ordinarily dwelt together in the patriarchal compound. Within that compound were arranged, endogamous, patrilateral first-cousin marriages. Life and marriage was lived patrilocally. And that's how things were for Israelites always. That's how it had always been and would be forever. And I mean forever, as in forever and ever, and don't you dare even think of changing it. This Israelite existence is basically how it was also with all other ancient MENA peoples, that's Middle Eastern North African peoples, and also other ancient Mediterraneans. Even today, this kind of lifestyle remains visible through much of that part of the world. When I say forever and ever, I'm not exaggerating. This cannot be stressed enough to American individualistic Christians who marry exogamous, self-selecting partners and tend to reside with them in neo-local homes. American Christians enjoy making absurd claims that they live in biblical ways and celebrate biblical marriage and how Bible-based their families are. But I gotta tell you, friends, they don't really know what they're talking about when they do this. For ancient Israelites and all other Mediterranean peoples, even after death, this embedded dwelling together continued. In first century Israel, everyone got buried together, rotted together, and awaited resurrection together. The domestic religious belief and practice of ancestorism was therefore hugely important to first century Israelites, as it was for all Mediterranean peoples. Unlike Americans, Christian or not, it makes no difference, who understand death as punctiliar. In contrast, ancient Israelites understood death as a lengthy, drawn-out process. So let's now go over what we know about the process to illuminate things about Jesus' death and burial. A word of caution. I mentioned earlier that our sources will be archaeological finds and scribal notes. Please keep in mind that no more than 2% of the total population of Herodian Syro-Palestine could read or write. Consequently, I should point out that the gospel writers belonged to and were sympathetic of the urban elite because they were literate. And since like writes about like, whenever anybody writes, they write about what they know. Since ancient Israelite authors were elites, then they must have had elite concerns, and these are readily discoverable in their writings. But what happens if they should write about a peasant or nothing person like the Galilean artisan Jesus? Please be aware that these authors, being far removed from the socioeconomic conditions of the Galilee, necessarily were perceiving things by looking over an uncrossable social divide, a chasm of extreme differences and experiences. This seldom discussed yet crucially important aspect of New Testament analysis applies very much to the evangelists we call Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. Being literate, their experience was far removed from the Galilee of Jesus and its illiterate and starving peasantry. So, with that understood, we will now describe burial practices for elite circles in Judea. Just keep in mind that we are not talking about the non-urban poor like Galilean peasant day laborer Jesus. Nor are we talking about what happens to a body of a condemned criminal. But don't worry, we'll get there. Imagine a first-century Jerusalem elite has died. Sometime between his final breath and sundown, slaves, overseen by significant family members, would lay out his body on a shelf or slab within the family tomb. Outside Jerusalem, artisans and day laborers had long before carved this tomb from the abundant limestone bedrock of the surround. The mourning process began. First on the agenda was the lengthy funeral. Even far from the gravesite, professional mourners could be heard, wailing and weeping, displaying the family honor to all around. Musicians would play instruments employed to induce altered states of consciousness, readily experienced at gravesites for millennia by Mediterranean personalities. Most Mediterraneans in the first century, even most elites, did not hold to what Plato and Aristotle believed about death, or about souls separating from bodies at the moment of death. Biblical peoples almost always did not think of themselves as souls that inhabited a body. They didn't think they had a body. Rather, they commonly understood that they were a body. In other words, for most Israelites, to be human was to be an animated body rather than an incarnated soul. Therefore, the etymology of the earthy Adam, essentially a bodily creature, is crucial in regarding how Israelites saw being human. After 4 days, most Israelites believed the life force of a dead person, more shadowy breath and soul, had left. Even still after this, female kinfolk continued sitting on the floor for at least a month, mourning. Indeed, throughout the whole year following the deceased person's last breath, mourning continued, as the body, sealed behind stone, decomposed. Often at wakes, Americans look down at the arranged, beloved figure in the coffin, a bloodless, organless facade drenched in preserving chemicals, and make comments like, "Well, at least she's not suffering anymore." Sentiments like these were most alien to the ancient Israelite mourning experience. In extreme contrast, our biblical ancestors believed that the snail's pace process of flesh rotting away was agonizingly painful. For the Israelite, feeling does not end with the last breath. It goes on through decomposition. However, they also considered this painful decomposition process to be expiatory of sins, acts that shamed or dishonored God. Our ancient Israelite ancestors imagined that a dead Israelite's evil acts were somehow embedded into his or her flesh. Therefore, they thought, as the flesh excruciatingly dissolved, so too the sins of the deceased also dissolved. Hence, Israelite mourning was a suffering in solidarity with the dead. Anointing a corpse with perfumes and rubbing salves and aloes on the body were meant to soothe the horrible pangs for a helpless sufferer undergoing the transition of decay. In the first days following the final breath, spending time close to the tomb was meant to help ease this torturous transformation for the deceased elite. This kind of mourning was the very best thing an elite could do for his or her deceased kin. Now consider, if the gospel writers, themselves elites, spent time writing about the dead Jesus being anointed, especially with costly oils and perfumes, do you think this reflects the experience of Galilean peasant villages, or the elite who lived in the Mediterranean polis? And does it reflect stage 1 of gospel formation, or stage 3? Once a year had passed, the mourning ritual concluded. By this point, all that would remain in the linen burial cloth would be dusty bones. These bones were important, sacred even. This was because first-century Israelites believed that the bones of a dead person held his or her personality and were essential for resurrection, by which God turns a human being into a star. The Pharisaic belief was that when the God of Israel eventually came to raise the dead person at resurrection day, his or her bones would be used as a support structure or scaffolding for a new sky vault flesh. Because of this Pharisaic hope, after 1 year of mourning, the tomb would be opened up, and a key process called ossulegium, or the collection of bones, would commence. Following 1 year of purification from sin in the putrefaction of flesh, the bones of the elite dead were collected and placed into a bone box called an ossuary. This was a second burial into a second casket. Rohrbaugh and Molina explained that the ossuary was designed to resemble a box for scrolls. The ossuary had to be just long enough to hold the femurs, the longest and strongest bones of the human body. These thigh bones got laid in like scroll spindles. There they would be kept safe until God gave them new sky vault flesh and a new inscription on Resurrection Day. We should note that the practice of ossulegium was so widespread in Israel that, despite its associations with resurrection, even the high-ranking Sadducees, like Caiaphas the high priest, had ornate ossuaries. Please take careful note of all this writing symbolism associated with the ossuary and second burial. Again, recall that only 2% of ancient Israelites could read and write. Therefore consider, from what sector of the society does this burial symbolism associated with scrolls and new inscriptions originate? Did it come from the illiterate Galilean poor, or from the elite urban population? I ought to mention that besides tools for writing, there was also another image and symbolism associated with femurs and the ossuary, more befitting a lowly social status. Some Israelites regarded the thigh bones as loom posts, with which God, seen as a weaver, would fashion and spin out a new sky vault body. Should it be surprising, then, given all this writing symbolism and weaving symbolism tied up with resurrection, that archaeologists have uncovered many inkwells and spindle whorls inside the excavated tombs? After a year of mourning came the second burial, which was a happy day. This day marked the end of the racking pains of the rotting deceased and the finality to the family's mourning process. On that day, the family turned toward the hope of family reunion and resurrection. But now imagine what would happen if somehow, at any point over this long process, the body vanished. Although difficult for American Christians to imagine it, to lose a body following death would be far more horrific than the death itself for an ancient Israelite. This may give us some insight as to what Mary Magdalene was emotionally going through in John chapter 20. This is a horror show, another biblical tale of terror. Because if you don't have those bones, how can you prepare them for resurrection? All Israelites would understand this terrifying predicament. Soon we will explore more on this topic and how the resurrection of Jesus interrupted the mourning process in a most surprising and extraordinary way. We will also look into how it affects the question of whether Jesus' death was wrong, against the will of God, or right and necessary. In a recent post, we explored the mourning and burial rituals of first-century elite Israelites. This was to better understand how the evangelists, themselves literate elites, understood Jesus' resurrection, an event that would interrupt the ordinary mourning and burial process. What did the evangelist resurrection account say, therefore, about the death of Jesus? Was it something right and necessary, in other words, in accordance with God's will, or was it wrong, and thus overturned by God? We also learned that ancient Israelites believed that suffering in the flesh continued after death. Israelites believed that the process of decay was agonizingly painful for the dead person. The flesh was believed to contain all the sinful acts the deceased Israelite had committed through life. But once the flesh had melted away, so too had the shameful offenses against the honor of God. We also explored the widespread practice of osologium, or the gathering of the bones, an essential final step in the Israelite mourning process. This was because it was widely believed that God would use the bones in giving resurrection to the deceased Israelite, for it was believed that the bones held the personality of the dead person. Without those bones, what is there to resurrect? Therefore, all Israelites would understand the horror if the corpse went missing. They would understand the terrible predicament of Mary Magdalene finding the tomb empty and the body of Jesus gone. But before we can truly understand Mary's predicament and the impact of experiencing the risen one, we need to consider a few more things. This is because Jesus was not an elite. Moreover, the peasant Jesus was condemned and executed. First, imagine a Judean elite person who was executed as a criminal. Under the law, the bones of the condemned had to be returned to his family, eventually. But this would not happen before 1 year following the execution. In the meantime, the Sanhedrin would take custody of the corpse. It would be placed into a special tomb maintained for this function. Was this supposed to happen to the executed Jesus taken down from the cross? Despite Jesus' peasant status, perhaps an echo of this was preserved in the Gospels, with accounts of elites like Joseph of Arimathea getting involved in the burial. The author we call John adds another ruler of the Judeans, Nicodemus. These are polished accounts, mind you. Could these story details be echoes of the Sanhedrin taking proper custody of the dead body of an elite condemned criminal? If so, over the decades between crucifixion and composition of the Gospels, things got polished by the Jesus groups. The original or historical purpose of Sanhedrin members taking possession of the corpse was not to honor the executed body. It certainly wasn't to provide peasant Jesus with enough embalming material as if he were a king being buried. In our United States cultural world, when lethal injection, electrocution, or other execution method gets employed, either professional physician or the medical examiner's office determines the exact point of death. Next, a coroner confirms this by signing a death certificate. Again, 21st century Western people understand death biomedically and occurring at an exact, unextended point in time. Culture shapes how we can and do perceive, think about, understand, and communicate reality, even death. Therefore, capital punishment, like death, was understood quite differently in the Mediterranean cultural world of first century Israelites than it is for 21st century United States people. Death for our ancient Israelite ancestors in the faith was far more involved than simply ending the life of the condemned person. In the biblical world, sentence of punishment lasted beyond physical death. Following the last breath of the condemned, all mourning for that person was suppressed. The dead corpse of the executed elite Israelite was imprisoned in a special tomb to languish through the agonizing yet purifying rotting process. He would decay, isolated and alone, without family mourning. The court oversaw the whole process, but once the flesh had all disintegrated, then the bones, now eligible for resurrection, would be returned to the family. Finally, the debt was paid, and the sentence carried out to the full. This, of course, reflects the fate of condemned and executed elites. But Galilean nothing person Jesus was not an elite. Nor was Jesus executed like most elites were. Rather, Jesus was crucified. So we should ask, what became of the corpses of crucified peasants? My friends, the answer is grim. You see, to be crucified in antiquity almost always was synonymous with being made food for scavengers, wild dogs, and birds. Again, don't think that what the elite enjoyed in life was the same as the plight of peasants. Don't think that when a regular elite Israelite died, the preparations that went into his burial were the same as what would happen to an Israelite Galilean peasant. And don't think that when an elite became a criminal and was executed, the aftermath was the same as when a peasant Galilean criminal was executed. And again, remember, the authors of the Gospels are elites. There is some evidence from Josephus and Philo that some crucified bodies were taken down from their crosses and buried, but these are exceptions that prove the rule of allowing the crucified dead to be eaten by animals. Once more, the Gospels were written by people belonging to 2% of the total population that could write, not Galilean peasants, nothing people. Things percolated and evolved through the decades. I should say now that it is official church teaching that Jesus was buried. Still, it makes one wonder, what an extraordinary thing it would have been for the crucified peasant Jesus to have actually been given burial. In any case, Richard Rohrbaugh and Bruce Molina inform us as to these cultural beliefs and practices, which give us a contextual framework through which to understand the significance of gospel accounts of Jesus' burial. By this context, we should better understand what is being claimed by the first generations of Jesus groups concerning the resurrected Jesus. When we read the account given in the fourth gospel, Jesus is crucified by the Romans, but was condemned by the Judean populace, both the crowds and leaders together. According to the fourth gospel we call John, the body of Jesus was taken down from the cross and placed in custody by a high-ranking Judean, Joseph of Arimathea. Jesus' body was secured in a tomb in order to serve out the sentence of decay, so as to atone for its sins or dishonoring the God of Israel. Jesus' proper burial place in Nazareth was far away to the north, so this would be a horror element in the story, were it not for the fourth Gospel's comedic irony. To suddenly find the tomb empty meant that the penal atonement process had been interrupted. In Johannine thought, Israel's chief priests and the entire Judean populace had judged that Jesus needed to rot away in atonement for his offenses, dishonoring the God of Israel, to prepare for resurrection. The understanding and proclamation that Jesus was raised means that the God of Israel has overturned the judgment of the Israelite people. Because there was no shameful sin in Jesus' flesh, according to the fourth gospel we call John, the God of Israel received Jesus into resurrection directly from his final breath. God overturned the death and decay sentence. Before the rotting occurred, God had intervened. That is how the Johannine Jesus group saw it anyway. For the fourth gospel to make the claim that Jesus was raised by God, that's passive voice, means that all the deeds and words of Jesus have been vindicated. Indeed, it could be no other way as far as the Johannine Jesus group was concerned. After all, according to the anti-society that wrote the fourth gospel, Jesus was the Word made flesh in Israel. How could God allow the Word of life to rot, to decay? Thus, God preserves the fleshly record of Jesus, the Word, complete and whole. My friends, there are major points of difference and disagreement between the synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and the fourth Gospel we call John. The earliest followers of Jesus who experienced the risen one still had to contend with the shameful death of Jesus. They grappled with this. Looking at the greater tradition which undergirds all the New Testament documents, we find the earlier pre-gospel claim that Jesus was given resurrection by God. This was the cultural understanding of ancient Israel applied to Jesus. Seen culturally, to claim resurrection for Jesus is to assert that his death was wrong, not belonging to God's will. And thus, God, the highest of all judges, has overturned this wrong. Resurrection is the reward for the righteous, and the righteous should not be condemned. But according to the culturally specific theological perspectives found within many New Testament documents, in a certain sense, Jesus' death was right and necessary. Throughout its history, Israel had interpreted itself as suffering wrath, suffering vengeance from God, because they believed they had shamed God. That's what sin is in the Bible, to shame God, to dishonor God. Israel believed it had sinned against or shamed its patron deity. And God was being viewed in Mediterranean analogy to Mediterranean patrons. If a client sins against his Mediterranean patron, like in the Godfather movies, the patron calls out a hit on you to defend his honor. Ancient Israelites believed that it was evident that Israel had shamed God and that God was taking out vengeance on his own people because they had been humiliatingly dominated under foreign powers for 7 centuries. God must have allowed that. Indeed, the wrath hurled collectively at all Israel was served out as Romans crucified Israelites. God allowed that to happen, so the Israelite interpretation went, and in doing so, God took satisfaction in defending God's honor, shamed repeatedly by the Israelite people. But so manfully heroic were Jesus' sufferings on the cross, so unwavering was Jesus' undying loyalty, something extraordinary happened. God, seen as a Godfather-style Mediterranean patron and father, was so impressed by this Israelite male Jesus' honorable sufferings that he waived the honor debt owed him by Israelites. To all Israelites united to the Godfather-style loyalty of Jesus, the faith of Jesus, whom God had rewarded with resurrection. By raising the crucified Israelite peasant Jesus, establishing him cosmic Lord and Messiah, God was about to institute Israelite theocracy in the land of Israel, the kingdom of God That's the gospel or innovation that Paul proclaimed decades prior to the composition of the Gospels. So we have here two interpretations of Jesus' death that we find in the New Testament. A cultural interpretation of Jesus' death, it is wrong. And a theological interpretation of Jesus' death, it is right and necessary. My friends, do you see how both of these interpretations clash? They contrast sharply. The theological interpretation has Jesus' death removing the shame of Israelite sin. So honored was God by Jesus' macho act that God waived his right to exact Mediterranean-style Godfather revenge on those who had dishonored God. When reading the Synoptic Gospels, please notice that both interpretations, the cultural, it's wrong, and the theological, it's right and necessary, are braided together, as it were. Someone took both these contradictory traditions and artistically weaved them together in Mark, Matthew, and Luke, creatively blending them into one paradoxical story. They run smoothly in one narrative sequence. Hence, in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus even predicts 3 times that he will die and be raised up. In contrast, the fourth gospel, called John, rejects this juxtaposition completely. There is no paradox in John. There is no dissonance presented in the fourth gospel between these two interpretations, cultural and theological. For according to John, the theological idea of Jesus' necessary redemptive suffering is completely abandoned. Only the cultural view remains. Jesus' death was wrong. Only that view was intelligible and definitive to the Johannine anti-society that wrote the fourth gospel. Why did Jesus have to die crucified according to the Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke? It was because of some mixture of right and wrong. The right reason being the necessary act of a true Israelite honoring God in an ultimate way, thereby impressing God to change and waive his right to avenge his besmirched honor. Here, Jesus must die, and God desired this deliberately for the benefit of others. Please understand that this idea is a far cry from later Christian penal substitutionary atonement theories. But why did Jesus have to die crucified according to the fourth gospel, called John? Well, that's just it. According to the fourth gospel, he didn't have to die, except for the calamitous intransigence of the wicked and hopelessly blind Judeans. Regardless of this vile evil and stupidity, the God of Israel rescued and vindicated Jesus, the very mediator of life itself. Either the author we call John knows nothing, or rejects completely any idea that Jesus died deliberately due to God wanting him dead to benefit anyone. My friends, the problem for us, 21st century Western Christians, is that this subtle yet major difference between the Synoptic Gospels and John is almost impossible for Western believers to see. Our blindness here results from sitting on 2,000 years of theological and devotional freight. Our pietism has produced a continual blending of all the gospel accounts together, like a cake batter, through our Christmas and Holy Week observances, religious art, private devotions, and movies. Consequently, 21st century Westerners tend to read the synoptic understanding into John, where it doesn't belong. Later, we will counter the common objection and misunderstanding that by calling Jesus the Lamb of God, the fourth gospel does see Jesus' death as right and necessary.
Why did Jesus have to die? Every year on Palm Sunday draws from the Synoptic Gospels, each year a different gospel, and reads the Passion according to Mark, as in the case with this year. Next year it'll be Luke, and the following year will be Matthew, and it cycles again. On Good Friday, however, we're Johannine. Every single year we read the Johannine Passion, the Passion according to the Gospel of John. So I want to mention that if we read it according to the context of the community in its original, understanding its anti-language, we would understand that the text has an ironic edge that we no longer use. Because as we read it, we've associated with 2,000 years of devotional freight, theological freight. So much emphasis in the second millennium of Christianity has been placed on the crucifixion, and we've welded together the synoptic passion. There's nothing related to comedy in the synoptic passion, Mark, Matthew, and Luke. But in John, there are elements which can even borderline with comedy. That Jesus is in the Johannine Jesus is in complete control. So we've lost that element, but it would be interesting to recover some of the aspects of the Johannine Passion. I want to talk about how the Johannine Passion, like everything in John, is obsessed with sevens, and there's patterns of sevens and step parallelism. And so you can break down the Johannine Passion account into 3 acts of 7 scenes. If you take the whole thing, that's 21 scenes. Scene number 1 and scene 21 are both in a garden. Scene number 1 and scene 21 are in a garden. The way this step parallelism works, when you have a pattern of 7 is a difficult number to balance, but the number to balance, of course, would be 4. So the 4th point is the point that John wants you to have. That's the main point of each act. Each act is divided into 7 scenes. The bookends are, of course, scene 1 and scene 7. You follow? Mm-hmm. Scene 4 is the main point of the act. If you've got 3 acts, right? You got 3 acts, then the absolute center of the whole schmear is scene 4 of Act 2. This is the whole point John wants to tell us for the whole Passion. And it's the scene where Jesus is crowned with thorns. We don't really put the emphasis on that point necessarily when we go through it, but actually that is the point of the Johannine Passion account, that Jesus, ironically, comedically, a Galilean, turns out to be, though they were mocking him, the king of the Judeans. That's the key. And the absolute bookends would be scene 1 of Act 2, which is in a garden, the Garden of Gethsemane, right? The Kidron Valley Garden. And then the Garden of the Tomb in scene 7 of Act 3. So these are the cues, but we don't have to grasp at straws wondering what the text is about, guessing what the Passion is about. What theme? Going through a big catalog of themes, scriptural themes, to find out what we can look at and what we can develop and bring out for people. No, the point is Jesus was crowned with thorns. That's the whole point. That's the literary artistry of John.
How would we relate that to our lives today?
It's difficult. Jesus is a real Mediterranean hero. And a real Mediterranean hero is a male that has been properly brought up by his father and the males in his village to take any beating without complaining. That's why that's reflected in the text we read in Hebrews, which says, even though he was a son, and our English translation is terrible, it's actually precisely because he was son. Every Mediterranean listener, male listener, would understand what that means. A Mediterranean male is conditioned in his upbringing to take any abuse without complaining, to defend the honor of his family. What kind of an American father, what kind of an American son would suffer such horrible abuse because his father would want that? It doesn't compute. It doesn't compute. So this is a difficulty that we have. How do we understand this? And then we have the fact that we tend to turn him into God, into Jehovah the Hutt. A vicious, sadistic guy who just wants his pound of flesh. He's been offended. Somebody has to pay the price. My Mediterranean son will be the one that pays the price. Send him in. So the Passion narratives, not only in John, but also in the Synoptics, tell us that Jesus prayed to his Father to remove his cup of suffering, but he concluded, not my will, your will be done. Now we have to relate those sentiments to the repeated and emphatic emphasis given in Proverbs 13 verse 24, 19 verse 18, 22 verse 15, 23 verse 13 to 14, 29 verse 15 and verse 17, and Sirach chapter 30, about how Israelite males are to be brought up. And you see they go really well together. It doesn't compute for us. The image resulting from these segments of Old Testament literature is shocking to Westerners. And so what do? Well, we tend to sentimentalize Good Friday and make it into a kind of a tragedy. I guarantee you that the original audiences did not see Good Friday as something tragic. They saw it as victorious. And they saw it in something very much in line with the ideal Mediterranean male, the hero. When in the synoptic version in Mark's Passion, now I'm going away from John for a moment, the centurion pierces Jesus, who hangs on a cross for 6 hours without complaining and then just cries out, "Ah!" and dies. He says, surely this was a son of God. What he meant by that was, surely this is a Mediterranean badass. He could take that without, he wasn't confessing anything like, I believe in Jesus' the hypostatic union, I believe he's the Deus Homo, I believe he's the second person of the Trinity. That's not what he meant by that. What he meant was, this is an ideal Mediterranean male. He died honorably. He died without complaint. I mean, if you're a male or a female in the United States, can you identify with that? No. It's very difficult. What American son would hang on a cross submitting to his father's desire for him to do that? A Western person would wonder why Jesus doesn't flee. Why doesn't he get out from this predicament? And the answer is very simple. Stoic endurance for pain and death among males is highly valued in this culture. Look at the martyrs today, recently from ISIS, that were on the Egyptian beach. Every one of them is a Mediterranean North African personality. Every single one of them were raised in that. And we could say, well, what peace they were given by God, and I'm not going to deny that they were given peace from God. But it sacramentally was mediated by how they were brought up as Mediterranean, Middle Eastern, North African males, men of personalities. That's how they're raised. So we have to take the in and incarnation very seriously and realize that some of this stuff doesn't translate directly, but only sacramentally. Maybe in our time we can think about our sufferings. We don't value our sufferings the same way, do we? No. We medicate them away. But we do have suffering though. And it's mysterious. And people go through pain and try to look for meaning. Perhaps we can find in the Spirit unity with the sufferings of Christ. But I think we need to get away from a childish notion that we're paying off some kind of debt that the Father has. That can't be literal, right? Is the Father sadistic?
That's a developed theology.
Yeah. So when we take the Good Friday readings of the Johannine Passion with Hebrews and Isaiah, the suffering servant songs, which we also go to, the Passion according to John gives us this opportunity to understand and appreciate our ancestors in the faith in their own terms without distorting them into being Western persons. We shouldn't be shocked and ashamed. God meets people where they're at, and God met our ancestors where they were at. They are our ancestors, and we shouldn't be ashamed of them. We shouldn't be ashamed of the in inspiration or the in incarnation. And we should be grateful for what they tell us, because it gives us a better understanding of Jesus as well. Taking the in and inspiration seriously means taking the in and incarnation seriously, considering Jesus as a real Mediterranean hero. And what that means. Now, for us, pain. A cancer patient told one of the context group of scholars once, hanging on a cross for 3 hours, hanging on a cross for 6 hours, try bone cancer. It's a different world and it's a different situation. We believe that Jesus truly, fully shared with us human suffering, death, cried out, and endured. But we have to be able to look at these things in an adult way, in a mature way. Mel Gibson's way, there's some problems with that, some serious problems. It's that just as if Jesus is the one who suffered the most pain of other people. The crucifixion is very agonizing, painful. Is it the most painful? Our ancestors in the faith would have seen it as enduring heroically a shameful end. Certainly was agonizing. The God-given ability that we have in our culture, not only to assuage physical pain, but also to eliminate it through morphine, spinal taps, different anesthetics, and so forth, challenges our notion of redemptive suffering.
That is so true.
The mystery today for Good Friday gives us a lot to think about, a lot to chew on.
The comedic part that you mentioned, that is in there. So many times I've read it, and I just don't see it.
Yeah.
And I don't think a lot of Westerners.
Ironic. I don't know how common. Yeah.
Ironic. Okay.
It's comedy in a more ancient.
Where he was born, where he's from. Is that the ironic part? The comedic part?
For John, right, who doesn't go into any earthly origins of Jesus. Jesus is a sky vault man.
Okay.
The Johannine Jesus is in complete control.
Okay.
It's Pilate in John who's on trial, not Jesus. Nobody takes Johannine Jesus' life, but he lays it down of his own accord. But in the Synoptics, he's crying out. You know, this is a hard. There is a Jesus in John is just in total control. Even he dies on his own call.
Right.
Right. He says, then when all these things were fulfilled, like he says, I thirst, and then he breathes the Spirit on the unnamed mother and the unnamed disciple, and then he dies. He dies on his own call. Nobody kills Jesus. In Mark, that isn't how it is in the Synoptics. Synoptics, he's executed, and it's a real execution, not something Jesus. I mean, he willingly goes along with it, but it's different. It's substantial. There's a lot of irony in the Johannine narrative, and there's a lot of irony in the Johannine Passion. Our liturgical celebration and how we read the Passion according to John, where we go back and forth with different readers, a chorus and a narrator, and the priest playing Jesus or the deacon playing Jesus, right? It was intended as a historicization of a faith festival, mainly as a result of an establishment of Christianity as a state religion in the 4th century. And it's been misused, of course. We've used it for anti-Semitic purposes. We've horribly abused our Jewish brothers and sisters using it, especially when you translate John by putting in the word Jews all over the place.
Yes.
Then
it should be Judeans.
It should be Judeans. It should not say King of the Jews. It should say King of the Judeans. And our New American Bible still hasn't fixed that. It's a big problem. Big problem. When Constantine converted, hordes of non-Israelites come pouring into the church for baptism. So these nominal Christians, they needed a way to experience the gospel reports, and this was recontextualized yet again. So the liturgy on Good Friday and the original Triduum, Friday, Saturday, Easter Vigil. Now our Triduum is Holy Thursday night, Good Friday, and Holy Saturday, right? Was a response to catechetical needs for these new converts coming in by the boatloads with Constantine, and the increased number of pilgrims that came pouring into Jerusalem, which now is being theologized and recontextualized again, completely new. Question: how might we contemporary American believers, with our contemporary catechetical needs, how can we access this celebration of Jesus' Passion? And that's a real question, isn't it? Because when I look at the advancements of scientific Western medicine, we see that we have made it possible to eliminate physical pain and suffering. We have been able to render physical pain and suffering little more than a nuisance. Well, that has serious implications for the traditional view of redemptive suffering. How can preachers and liturgical planners help American worshipers to appreciate the perspective of John about Jesus' passion and death, which already by the 4th century, when this became a feast, had been recontextualized a few times, by the way, by that point. Then we look at the beautiful interreligious harmony we're supposed to have post-Vatican II. Big changes, ecumenical and interreligious dialogues, especially with our Jewish brothers and sisters, Christians and Jews, the Catholic Church and Jewish brothers and sisters. That has given us an increased sensitivity over the last few decades. So there's a consensus among scholars building that the word Jews used in the 4th Gospel English translations is just anachronistic English translation of the Greek word Judaioi, the Hebrew Yehudim. That these should not ever be translated Jews. There are no Jews in the 4th Gospel. There are Judeans in the 4th Gospel, and or Judaic people. We would do very well to eliminate altogether in our modern Bible translations, not only in John, but anywhere in the Old and New Testament, the word Jew. It's troublesome. It's causing big problems. It's anachronistic. It's just an issue. It's a big issue. Also along these lines, we could also talk about supersessionism. Sometimes when you hear modern Christian apologists a lot, I can think of some names, and a lot of triumphalistic neo-Orthodox Catholics programming and social media. The Old Testament is treated as something that only has value and meaning if the New Testament is there to tell you what the meaning is. Is that really how our Jewish brothers and sisters use these texts? They don't call it the Old Testament, they call it, right, their Tanakh? Is that how our Muslim brothers and sisters use these texts? Saying it's void of meaning until, Jesus comes along and that's it, then that's the meaning right there? I think that's a problem. That's supersessionism. That idea, right, that, and it's a big tendency we have as Christians, that we only see the Old Testament as having value if it is fulfilled and surpassed in the New Testament. What do Isaiah's songs of the suffering servant that we read on Good Friday mean to contemporary Jewish worshipers? And how does that compare with how we contemporary Christian worshipers treat these songs? And some fundamentalists use them as proof texts. So that's talking about Jesus exactly, Or is it talking about Israel collectively in its literal sense? Since prophecy is not about predicting the future, but rather proclaiming God's will for the here and now.